Now let us proceed with our discussions of the clause 30 related to the certificates and the payment. Previously we discussed about the set off by the employer. There are a series of circumstances where the employer is entitled to set off the cost from the contractor. There are also rules for the employer to follow in order to set off the amount from the contractor. In these videos, we're going to proceed our discussions with the retention fund. Bear in mind that this retention fund is different from the set off that we have mentioned previously. The set off here is normally related to the contractor not being able to fulfill his obligations and often reluctant to ratify it, which as a result lead to the loss and expenses to the employer. Since now the problem is due to the contractor, the employer is entitled to salvage the cost from the contractor, which is by doing this set off. In another word, this set off is a responsive actions by the employer when the contractor do not fulfill his obligations or reluctant to fulfill his obligations. However, when we talk about this retention fund, it is actually used to safeguard for any defects or non-conforming work by the contractor. Whenever there is any payment to the contractor, a certain amount as specified in the appendix, which is typically 5%, shall be retained by the employer in the case that there are some defects or non-conforming work by the contractor. This retention fund may be used to finance the rectification job. This serves more like a preventive measures as compared to the set off, which is responsive measures. In the case that there is no defective works, this retention fund shall be returned fully back to the contractor. Or in the case that there are some defective works which are claimed from this retention fund, whichever balance shall be returned to the contractor at the end of the project. With that, you should be able to differentiate the retention fund and also the set off by the employer. Now, the employer may retain the percentage of the total of the works, materials and goods, and this percentage are normally specified in the appendix, which is typically 5% of the work done at that particular instant, and the amount to be retained shall not be greater than the limits of the retention fund. This limits is governed by 3 conditions. The first one, it would be that 5% as stated in the appendix. That will be the maximum amount that can be retained by the employer. The retention fund is subjected to reductions under clause 16.1d and 16.1f. This is when half of the retention fund should be released upon issuance of the certificate of partial completions, and then it shall be released for the remaining amount upon issuance of the certificate of making good defects. Theoretically, the entire project ended after the certificate of making goods defects, or in another word, after all the defects has been made good, there is no need to further ratify the work, as it is no longer under the liability of the contractor, since it has already exceeded the defect liability period. The limits of the retention fund should also be reduced under clause 27.7. It is when the nominated subcontractor has indemnified the contractors against all his liability to the contractor. What you see here, this retention fund is strongly related to the liability of the contractors to the employer. The higher the liability, the larger amount to be retained by the employer. This shall be limited to the 5% of the amount of the work done by the contractor. Now, upon the issuance of certificate of partial completions or issuance of the certificates of making good defects, as well as release of the liability of the contractors on the NSC part, now the amount liable to the contractor reduces. With that, the amount for the retention fund shall be reduced accordingly. Now let us talk about the rules regarding the retention fund. First is about setting up a trust account. You know that this retention fund is retained by the employer during payment made to the contractor. Therefore, this amount is theoretically on the employer's hand. In another word, the employer is now the trustee for the contractors, NSC and also NS. That means the contractors, nominated subcontractor and nominated supplier will need to entrust the employer regarding this amount of money. The employer is not obligated to invest this amount of money. And the contractors, nominated subcontractors, nominated suppliers' interest is subjected to the right of the employer to have recourse for payment. That means they have the right to ask for the payment when they are entitled to. Now, if any of the party demands for the retention fund to be paid into a trust account, within 14 days, the employer will have to do so. The trust account here, it is so that this amount of money is held by the third party as appointed by the demanding party. Under these circumstances, the employer no longer holds this money. It is to prevent the employer to exploit this money without the consensus from the contractor, nominated subcontractor and the nominated supplier. If they do not believe the employer, they can demand this amount of money held by the third party, which is neutral, in order to facilitate this retention fund process. However, this demand here will need to be sent in written and send a copy to make known to the architect, so that the architect are aware of where is the locations of the money. Now, if this trust account is applied, all the costs of setting up the trust account shall be bounded by the contractors or NSC or NS. That means the requesting party will have to bound with the cost for setting up the trust account. Next is about the notifications of retention fund. When the employer exercises the retention fund, the employer will need to inform to the relevant parties in writtens, providing the reasons. This is to make known to the contractor, nominated subcontractor, and also the nominated supplier regarding the exercising of the retention fund. Next is about the release of retention fund. The retention fund is released in two stages. First is upon the issuance of the certificate of practical completions, and the second is upon the issuance of certificates of making good defects. Upon issuance of the certificate of practical completions, Within 14 days, the architect will need to issue a certificate for the release of half of the retention fund. Later, upon issuance of the certificate of making good defects, within 14 days, the architect will need to issue another certificate in order to release the remaining amount of the retention fund. The contractor shall receive the payment within the period of honouring certificates, which is typically within 21 days. Theoretically, the liability of the contractor has completely ended after the certificates of making good defects. For that reason, there is no need for the retention fund held by the employer.